Okay, good morning, and thank you for joining us. My name is Pam Clark-Reidenbach, and I'm the Executive Director of the Northern Illinois Center for Nonprofit Excellence, also known as NICNE. Today's training session and 3 additional to follow are provided to you through the Youth Mental Health System of Care, a variety of youth-serving providers and parents of children with lived experience working to build a comprehensive, high-quality mental health system that is affordable and accessible to all. The design of the system of care, including these trainings, are made possible by a grant from the Children's Healthcare Foundation. The trainings are the start of a community of practice for youth-serving mental health providers. After today's session, you'll receive additional information on how you can get engaged in the system of care, but don't hesitate to reach out to any current member of the system to learn more. We'll put in the chat a list of our current participants. So now it is my pleasure to introduce our trainer for today's session. Jessica Oladapo is a social scientist by trade with education and formal training in sociology and social and counseling psychology. She began her career as a social worker in 2005, but soon transitioned to teaching in higher education in 2009. Ms. Oladapo has taught courses in sociology and psychology with an emphasis on social justice and restorative justice practices. In 2015, after being persuaded to conduct a diversity training for a community police department and school district, she was called to create Diversity to Inclusion Incorporated. Since that time, Ms. Oladapo has expanded program offerings to include diversity trainings, individual equity coaching, facilitation, and racial equity, team planning, and facilitation for numerous organizations and institutions. Ms. Oladapo has provided training for a long list of clients, including global corporations, school districts, religious organizations, banking institutions, park districts, right? Higher education institutions, and more. Please help me to welcome Jessica Oladapo.
Thank you. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thank you all for joining this morning. I am so excited to engage in this conversation with all of you. I see some familiar faces and some familiar names on the screen. So welcome. This morning's conversation is called Creating Spaces of Belonging Through Cultural Humility. And I am personally so interested in and so motivated by the willingness of folks to engage in conversations about belonging, and not just conversations about diversity and inclusion, but really engaging in the conversations of belonging. And so that's really what we hope to see as we engage in these 2 conversations. So the first conversation today, and then a week from today, we'll continue the conversation as well. The goals of today's conversation: 1, to develop a common understanding and normalize language around cultural competence, cultural humility, belonging, and really begin to think about how all of that relates to bias, implicit bias, unconscious bias. The second goal is to consider the difference between belonging and otherness, or belonging and othering. The third goal is to consider how implicit bias impacts and is impacted by communication. And then finally, consider at least 1 strategy to combat implicit bias. I will tell you that after engaging in this work for a couple of years, when I first began engaging in the work, I used to enter into the conversations and tell folks, here are all the problems. And what I found was that at the end, folks would come up and they would say, cool, we understand what the problems are. In fact, we live the problems every day, or we live these challenges every day. What do we do? And so I do like to end with at least 1 strategy to combat implicit bias. And so those are the overarching goals. I was really, honestly happy to engage in this conversation with all of you. As you heard in my bio, I began my career as a social worker at first working with folks who were transitioning out of foster care into adulthood. So working in transitional living homes, and then began to work in foster care as a foster care caseworker, and then was able to transition into teaching in higher education. And so the bulk of my work experience throughout my life has been focused on how do we help? And this is one of the quotes that really sticks out with me by Mr. Rogers. When I was a boy, I would see scary things in the news, and my mother would say, look for the helpers. You will always find people who are helping. And so I say that to say that all of you are incredibly important in this work. And as we begin to really understand things like implicit bias and things like creating spaces of belonging, then we can really understand how we can be even more impactful in the work that we do on an everyday basis. So again, I want to thank you for the work that all of you do, the educators, folks who work with children, folks who work in the mental health field as well. So thank you. So what this conversation is not, I like to start there. What it is not. So conversations around diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. So belonging is rather new in the conversation. It began really in the late 1900s. Late 1900s. I sound like my kids now. My kids are like, oh, you were born in the late 1900s, because I was born in 1980. That's not really what I mean. It began in the late 1980s into the 1990s. And really it began as a way of ensuring kind of compliance, right? Ensuring that people were not engaging in discriminatory practices in the workplace. And so diversity, equity, inclusion, and again, belonging trainings and conversations really began, and it looked like lists of groups and oftentimes some stereotypical attributes. So when you engage with people of this particular group, you make eye contact or you don't make eye contact, or you shake their hand or you don't shake their hand. And that's really the way the conversation began. And it was extremely well-intentioned, oftentimes, again, run by human resource professionals, again, in the interest of ensuring that discriminatory practices weren't commonplace in that particular workplace. The benefit of being human is that as we know better, we do better. And so as time went on, we began to see that engaging in the conversation in that particular way actually was the opposite of the goal. If we have a list of groups and some stereotypical attributes, then unfortunately that only serves to reinforce stereotypes that we already have of those groups. So what this conversation is not, it is not that. It is not a list of groups and stereotypical attributes as it encourages stereotypes. It is also not a quick fix. It is also not always comfortable. In fact, it should not be comfortable, because what we know is that growth never happens in the comfort zone. So it should encourage us to move beyond our comfort zone into thinking about the world in a much more expansive way. But also, really importantly, really significantly, this conversation is not a dull conversation. But what it is, this conversation is a space to be introspective. I'm not going to read through all of these, but in summation, it is a space to be introspective and to consider how we all contribute to diversity. It is also a space for us to think about our own intersecting identities. And I use the Rubik's Cube example. You hear me talk about that a little bit later, but our own intersecting identities and how those intersecting identities impact the way in which we navigate the world. And if we can think about how our intersecting identities impact us, then we can have the same level of understanding or a similar level of understanding for other people as well, right? All of us are walking through the world with various identities, various statuses, right? and that impacts both the way that we see, experience, and perceive the world. And so that's really what this conversation will be. Another one of my favorite statements here is, it is a space to learn about self and others in a constructive manner. And so I challenge you, as we engage in the conversation and even after, to begin to think about ourselves and others in a way, again, that is expansive. Also, so as was read in my bio, I have been doing this particular work, the work of training, since 2015. And initially, I will tell you that I did not want to do this work. I was very comfortable in the college classroom. I was extremely comfortable in the college classroom. I enjoyed teaching psychology and sociology. I enjoyed the relationship building that I had with my students. And because of the relationship building and the passion that I had and the willingness to encourage critical thought, there were folks who came to me from different spaces. They had no idea that that other people were coming to me. They began to come and they began to ask me to engage in these sorts of conversations outside of the college classroom. And again, initially, I was like, absolutely not. I am extremely comfortable in the classroom. I love my students. This is the only thing that I want to do. And again, after about a year of being asked by several different people and several different entities, I finally gave in. But before I gave in, I sat with myself and thought, I don't want to do this work just for the sake of doing this work. I don't want to be out here talking to folks just for the sake of talking to folks, right? It is my goal to really understand, right? And to, again, sit with myself and think about, what do I hope to accomplish in doing and engaging in these conversations? And so I developed this formula for growth pretty early on. And the formula for growth began with diversity, equity, and inclusion work, plus courage, plus vulnerability, self-vulnerability, right? Plus curiosity. Removing guilt and stagnation leads to decreased bias, increased awareness, and increased empathy. And that's honestly where I ended the formula back in 2015, right? That as an educator, as someone who is working in social services, as someone who is concerned with people, as a helper, if we can just get people to empathy, then we have arrived, right? If we can get people to have some empathy for others and understanding, then we have arrived. However, as I continued to engage in the work, I realized that people had reached empathy, and sometimes they had reached empathy and they were continued to have empathy, and then they were tapped out of empathy, right? Because all of a sudden now, I'm worn out. And so I realized that it's not just empathy that we need, but there are some other steps as well. And so recently, within the past year, the formula has grown to include, so once we reach empathy, then we can engage in collective healing. And collective healing might look like conversations like this, where those of us who are helpers can come together and help to heal each other, right? So collective healing leads to growth and action. And action might look like policy changes. I work with schools, individual schools and school districts. And in some of those schools and school districts, we are now having conversations about, how do we create policy? Let's tear apart our handbook such that we are actually being equitable and creating spaces of belonging for students, for employees of the school building or the school district, for families, for everyone involved in the educational process. So growth and action will then lead to collective liberation. And that is really the goal, right? For me, the goal of engaging in the work is collective liberation. Now, that's the goal today. In 2 years, who knows? There might be like 4 more lines of this. It might be collective liberation leads to something else. I have no idea. But today, the goal looks like collective liberation. And that's the importance of the mindset and engaging in this work, that we have to have a kind of a goal in mind. However, even as we have a goal in mind, recognizing that this is a never-ending journey, right? So the path to inclusion, equity, belonging, and transformation is a never-ending journey, beginning wherever you are currently, within different families, workplaces, rooms, on this Zoom call, societies. People are at different points in their journeys, and our task is to consider our own path, our own journey, remaining in constant self-reflection and self-evaluation, engaging in frequent self-checks along the way. A couple of years ago, my mother's goal, my mother had a dream, it was on her bucket list, of taking her grandchildren down to the happiest place on earth, Disney. And I have 4 kids. There are 11 grandchildren total. And so we took a family trip down to Disney, or we began to plan this family trip down to Disney, the happiest place on earth, right? And as we were beginning to plan, we had to be clear of a couple of things. One, I've got a brother who lives on the East Coast. I've got another brother who lives north of us. And we had to be clear that our journeys looked different, even as the end goal was the same. Our destination was the same. In other words, I could not call my brother who lives on the East Coast and say, okay, we're leaving Thursday morning at 8 a.m. so that we can arrive at Disney on this particular day at this particular time. So you also have to leave at 8 a.m. and you have to take I-57, because there is no I-57 where he lives. There is no I-90 where he lives, right? And so we had to trust that he knew his own path. We had to trust that he knew what the destination was and that he knew how to get there. Now, it is our role, it is our job to provide supports. It is not our job, it is not our role to dictate how someone else gets there. That's not my job, right? So even within this conversation for me is one of those layers of support. If we are actively attempting to accomplish collectively equity and inclusion and belonging in the spaces in which we work. And really, this looks like, if we're doing it for the spaces that we work, hopefully also we're doing it for our everyday lived experiences, right? In every single situation, right? It is my role in this moment to facilitate that and to provide an additional layer of support. I'll also tell you that we arrived at Disney on one of the hottest days of the year. We were standing still, doing absolutely nothing, drenched with sweat. There were 1 million people in the park. I don't think I'm exaggerating. 1 million people in the park, and we quickly discovered that it was not the happiest place on earth. And so what we realized was that sometimes once we get to the destination where we think we have arrived, there's a little bit further that we can go, right? So for instance, I thought the end goal was going to be empathy. And we begin to have conversations about empathy, and we realize there's a little bit further we can go. So in a real way, in a literal sense, we decided we would only spend 1 day at Disney, and we spent the rest of the time at Universal Studios, which was much more conducive and enjoyable for our family, right? So then being able to go a little bit further, being flexible enough to realize that sometimes what we think the goal is, when we arrive there, we can go just a little bit further. And so the road to inclusion, equity, and belonging is a never-ending journey. Being willing to consistently engage in these conversations, and being willing to consistently also engage in constant self-reflection. So why now? I would love to open it up for anyone to share either in the chat or out loud. Why is the conversation around diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging an important conversation to have right now in this moment? Feel free to unmute and or put it in the chat. Why now?
Good morning. May I share?
Absolutely. Thank you.
Hi. So I'm actually attending from Calgary, Alberta, Canada, from the traditional territory of the Blackfoot people. And so what's happening currently up here is we're having a lot of really uncomfortable discussions about the history of residential schools in our country.
Mhm.
So one thing that I do is I work with Blackfoot children in a group home setting.
Mhm.
And for us in particular, there is a constant desire to create that belonging in, a world that is unfortunately actively hostile to these young people. But a lot of them, due to a lot of intergenerational trauma, are struggling to have those feelings of connection and belonging. So I see it as a really important part of the healing and growth. Like, we're no longer talking about, um, how individuals can, cope better with the state of things, but how we can support them as a community, I suppose.
Yeah, I love that. Thank you. And so what I hear is it isn't the individual who has experienced oppression. It isn't their responsibility to create belonging, right? But it is what is the responsibility of the society? What is the responsibility of individuals within that society to be self-reflective and think about the history and how that has impacted the lived experiences of people now, even as it relates to generational harm. And so that awareness of generational harm really creates a need for the society to do something. Did I capture kind of what you were saying?
Definitely. I mean, it's a very complicated topic, but yeah, no, that's definitely it. Thank you.
Yep. Thank you so much. That's huge. Any other thoughts on the why now?
Kevin had shared in the chat that the modern civil rights movement, Black Lives Matter, has been going on for years, and only now a majority of Americans are recognizing that work.
Mm-hmm. Yep, absolutely. Absolutely. Any other thoughts?
Tyler pointed out that definitions and the reach of the topic is constantly changing and evolving, but there's always room to learn more.
Yep. In fact, I was just reading recently and in one of the authors in the book, they said that one of the challenges in having conversations is that we don't have a collective understanding of things like what is racism, right? That there's so much involved in racism. And in other words, language can then be limiting in helping us to understand certain concepts, which then makes it difficult to engage in the conversation. But that's also the reason why we have an obligation to engage in the conversation such that we can have some collective growth and collective healing. For me, the why now really kind of gets at something that is rather theoretical in nature. I have to be honest, I live in theory and nuance, right? I'm always thinking theory and nuance in my head. And for me, the why now always kind of gets me to thinking about the moving day or when we move. And so anytime I have this conversation, I think about moving day. How am I supporting people in their move? So a number of years ago in 2017, I was living in Northern Illinois, and I had been living in Northern Illinois for almost 8 years, and I loved it, but I also really wanted to move back to my hometown. And I was actively in the moment I was providing a diversity training for an institution of higher education, but also I was actively preparing to move, like packing up my house, actively preparing to move. And as I was providing this training to this institution of higher education, I paid attention to the number of times I used the words, let's unpack this. And I always say that if you're ever in conversation with me, whether we're talking about whatever we're talking about, I'm going to say, let's unpack this. And so I paid attention to the number of times I said that, but then I thought about how does this relate to the literal unpacking that I will do soon, right? And so at the time I was going through my house and I was packing up my home, going room to room and labeling the boxes, painstakingly labeling the boxes, right? This is the kitchen box, the blue bedroom, the purple bedroom, the downstairs bathroom, the upstairs bathroom, storage. So I had all of my boxes labeled. And it came time for moving day. And we put all of my boxes, I've got 5 brothers, 3 of them have helped me move every time I have moved. They have since retired because I am never going to move again. And so we put all my boxes on the truck, and we drove down 90, pulled up in front of the house, began to unpack the boxes, those boxes that have those labels on them. And my brothers, bless them, they took all the boxes off of the truck and placed them squarely in the center of the living room. And I said to my brothers, yo, these boxes, they have labels on them. Like you can, and my brother said, yeah, they have labels on them so that you know where to put them when you begin to unpack. And so now I have a living room that is filled with boxes. In a figurative sense, that reminded me of something called schema theory. And schema theory describes a pattern of thoughts or behavior that organizes categories of information and the relationships among them. In other words, our brains are literally like, or very similar to, that living room that has boxes. So humans, we have boxes, and some folks will say with schema theory, file folders. They're like file folders where we categorize. So humans naturally categorize. It is part of the way that our brains work. So we have, for the purposes of this analogy, we have these boxes with stuff inside of them. Now, as we get older, we're able to differentiate a bit more. So an example of this, my second daughter, she's 13 now, but when she was between 12 and 18 months, I took her to the zoo and she knew what a dog was. A dog is a animal that has 4 legs and hair all over its body and ears that look like so and a face that looks like so. And she saw the dog, or she saw a tiger and she was like, oh, dog. She saw a goat and she was like, oh, dog. She saw a sheep and she was like, oh, dog, right? Because in her living room, she has a box that's labeled dog. And anything that looks like or looks similar to dog, she's tossing it into that box. Oh, I know what that is. That's a dog, right? As we get older, we're able to differentiate a bit more, but we're still engaging in the same behavior. One of the benefits of conversations such as this is that it allows us, it encourages us to open our boxes to see what we have stored and ensuring that we aren't tossing tigers into the box that's labeled dog, right? The other thing that it allows for us to do, so when we move, we have our boxes that are labeled, and sometimes, unfortunately, things get damaged while they are in transition. Or sometimes we have stuff that's stored in our boxes that's related to sentimental value, right? Or it's related to tradition, and it's really not functional. And that's one of the conversations that I frequently have with helpers, is that a lot of the things that we do in the helping professions is related to tradition, or it's related to sentimental value, or it's related to, well, we've always done it this way. So again, conversations such as this allows for us to open those boxes and see if those things that we have stored are functional, or how can we better ensure belonging by really thinking about, does this create belonging, or does this allow for more marginalization to occur within our professions, right? Now, I will also tell you that there are some people who, in a very literal sense, unpacking is backbreaking work, and folks don't really like to unpack. Like, that's the worst part of moving, right? The unpacking is the worst part of moving. So there are some folks who are able to navigate that living room, even with the lights off, right? We're able to like figure out without bumping into anything. In a figurative sense, there are people who are able to navigate the world without ever unpacking the things that they have stored, without ever unpacking things that might actually be stereotypes, without ever unpacking the things that might actually be related to bias, without ever unpacking those things. We're just navigating the world without unpacking. However, if we are to do the work of equity, if we are to do the work of belonging, it is so beneficial for us to engage in the uncomfortable work of unpacking those boxes and seeing what we have stored. Finally, it's also important to recognize that even as we unpack and we put things in their rightful place, and now our living room is nice and clear, free of clutter, or at least sometimes we might think that they are free of clutter, and then we might trip over a box later on. But even after things are free and clear of clutter, after we have put things away, we still have to, and I don't like to should on people, I don't like to tell people what they should do. However, it is important for us to continue to engage in maintenance work. And so again, maintenance work might include conversations like this. Maintenance work might include creating spaces of equity or equity teams or the like in our workplace, such that we are ensuring that these conversations remain central, right? Such that we don't get caught up in the everyday mundane things, and that we are really considering equity, inclusion, and belonging for our clients and the people that we serve. I like to bake for people, and in liking to bake for people, I will pull out my bundt pan and I'll bake a nice, beautiful pound cake. And I don't get to just put that bundt pan back away. I have to evaluate it after I use it. Is this still a nonstick bundt pan? If it is still a nonstick bundt pan, then I clean it off and put it back away for later use. But if it is no longer a nonstick bundt pan, then it is possible that I might want to toss it and replace it with something new. And when I say that, we might be thinking about policies that are no longer functional. We might be thinking about biases, individual biases that we might have that are no longer functional. We might be thinking about techniques and tools that we may have used that are no longer functional. We may be thinking about policies and practices. I said policies already, but practices, curriculums that are no longer functional, right? So we have a responsibility to evaluate those things. If they are still functional, put them away for later use or continue to use them, but continue to go through the process of evaluation, self-reflection, the maintenance work. Any thoughts on that example? The moving day example. So hopefully this is a moving day, or at least even a maintenance day. So what makes this conversation difficult? What makes the conversation difficult? Anybody in the chat or out loud? Even if we are to only think about the moving day conversation, what makes the moving day conversation difficult? What makes unpacking our boxes difficult?
This is Sandy. I think that this conversation can be difficult because we like things to be the same. We like to find similarities, and we are as human beings, I think, conditioned to be uncomfortable with unfamiliarity or differences.
Yeah, thank you, Sandy. That is a really good point. We like to have what is called in psychology homeostasis, right? We like to have this comfort level, and that is related to like our body temperatures, that is related to our breathing, right? That's why exercise is challenging, because we are moving beyond homeostasis. And then as soon as we like get winded, right? Our bodies attempt to, okay, stop. This is uncomfortable. But again, what we know is that if we want to see change, we have to push beyond that. And so, yes, I believe that you are right. We seek homeostasis. We seek comfort. Any other thoughts?
Some great comments in the chat.
And I was going to add, if you can hear me, is that this is difficult work. And a lot of people don't like unpacking and uncovering maybe the biases and the racism that they've grown up with and ingested. And it's more comfortable not to look at it than actually work the process and unlearn it.
Yep, absolutely. Mirrors can be challenging. I was chatting with a friend this weekend. She went on vacation, and she said there is nothing like a good hotel mirror. A good hotel mirror, it's a trick mirror, and it shows you all the good stuff, right? And she's like, I want to take this mirror home because I like this mirror better than the mirror that I have at home. In other words, we like to see reflected back at us the good stuff in us, right? We like to see reflected back, oh no, you don't have any biases. But I will tell you, as humans, we all have biases, right? We all prejudge. As humans, again, that is just part of the human condition because of the way we categorize. In one sense as well, it is related to evolution in that it keeps us safe, right? If I know something and I can categorize it, then I don't have to rethink it every time that I come across it. Then I can avoid danger. If I perceive that thing as dangerous, I don't deal with it, right? So from an evolutionary standpoint, it keeps us safe. However, from a social standpoint, that's really damaging and creates limitations and barriers to belonging. So thank you, Kevin. What's in the chat, Billy?
A lot of fantastic comments. So echoing that conversations can be difficult out of fear, especially from a health perspective. There can be fear of offending somebody or being insensitive.
Mm-hmm.
Jamelin shared that people want to feel that they're good, and once they're confronted with their own biases, they feel bad, which leads to more negative feelings and often avoidance.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah.
I actually think that it can be pretty multidimensional. There's a huge underlying level of guilt behind racism.
Mm-hmm.
When we talk about racism and Black Lives Matters, of course, then the conversation becomes an all lives matter issue. Mm-hmm. And well, yes, but it comes back to equity. There's such an deep fear behind talking about privilege and what that means. And
it can become very volatile. I had an experience just last night. I was at a pharmacy and I said hello to everyone there. I mean, things are opening up in Rockford, Illinois, and so people were going mask free. So I was saying hi, people without that are vaccinated, and I was saying hello. And there was one person, one African American man, became very upset, and clearly he had had a rough day, and I was trying to recognize his feelings, but everyone around me became very upset that he was becoming very upset, and it became a much bigger issue. And I think I tried to continue to communicate that, what, he's having a rough day, just let him go. And someone called the police, and so I stayed back and said, no, he didn't make a threat, he didn't say anything offensive, he didn't become physical, but it became an us versus them thing. And it was, I was pretty surprised by it, shooken up by it, and it was surprising to me, but I guess I shouldn't be. But people have this deep anger behind talking about the Black Lives Matter movement, and anything around anyone that experiences racism and gets frustrated by it, because I'm sure he was frustrated by it, and I'm sure people can be frustrated by it. I'm frustrated by it, and we should be.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. And what I hear from that too is that there is a level of fear, and that level of fear is sometimes connected to and presents as frustration or anxiety in some way, right? But really it comes back to this level of fear. And whether that level of fear is, I am afraid that if I say something that someone else might be offended, or I'm afraid that if I say the wrong thing, it might be perceived as racism, or if I say the wrong thing, it might be perceived as homophobia or transphobia or classism, or, right? So oftentimes when I ask this question, the underlying theme is fear. And then fear then presents as guilt, or fear presents as anxiety, or fear presents as frustration. And that tends to be the underlying theme, right? But that's also related to history. Nothing happens in a vacuum. So what makes this conversation difficult really is rooted in the structure of our societies and the way that we have not dealt with difference, right? The way that we have attempted to say, oh, difference doesn't matter. So here's a little bit of background. And this applies to both the US and really kind of globally, right? But particularly in the US, prior to the 1950s and the 60s, people were very free with discussing and talking about openly their biases, especially as it related to race, right? By the 1950s and 60s and the civil rights movements, there becomes policies, and really in the 1950s, people are still free, right? Because the policies of the 1950s, right? The Brown versus Board of Education, schools must desegregate with all deliberate speed, has nothing to do with housing. It has nothing to do with jobs. It has only to do with schools desegregating with all deliberate speed. And those states that had legal segregation, de jure segregation, they were like, well, we don't really, with all deliberate speed, I mean, that could be forever. We don't really have to do anything. We can continue to say things like, if children go to school, if Black children and white children go to school together, that will create a mongrel race of people. And that's actual language that was used. So people were very free in those conversations. By the 1960s, however, the federal government gets involved in policy, and not just in policy, but also enforcing that policy, right? Then not only do we have conversations about desegregation as it relates to race in schooling, but also we have conversations about integration in housing, and conversations about women in the workforce, and conversations about the protected classes. Then we have conversations about ability by the 1970s, and we have conversations about how do we protect women who are pregnant by 1978, right? So we have federal policy. As we begin to have federal policy, people begin to say things like, well, we can't have those conversations because they are not politically correct. Notice I did not say we can't have those conversations, we can't say racist things because it's not right, it's not true, but rather it was, it's not politically correct, right? As time moves on though, politically correctness becomes attached to identities. So if I am saying things that aren't politically correct, then other people will begin to say, well, that's not nice. You're not nice. Nice people don't say those things, right? So now political correctness becomes a character trait. On the other hand, racism now also, sexism also becomes a character trait, such that people will say, oh, that person is racist, and other people will say, they're not racist, they're nice. As though niceness and racist are opposite of each other. One really great example of this, Paula Deen a number of years ago decided that she was going to create this restaurant, and this restaurant was going to be a throwback to the antebellum era, a throwback to prior to the end of enslavement, and the people who were going to be serving the food were going to be Black, and they were going to wear servants' costumes or uniforms. I don't know what she called them. And people began to say, Paula, you can't do that. That is a racist idea. And other folks began to say, Paula's not racist. She doesn't have my favorite. She doesn't have a racist bone in her body. And I don't know where the racist bone is located. She doesn't have a racist bone in her body, right? She is nice. However, the idea, as the idea was presented, was an incredibly racist idea, made challenging by the fact that not only do we find it uncomfortable to have the conversation, but now we have attached it to identity as a character trait, right? In other words, racism is not a character trait. Sexism is not a character trait. Homophobia, transphobia, classism, bias related to religion, ability, that's not a character trait, right? So the ability to kind of disconnect racist bias actions and beliefs from identity is important to have the conversation. In other words, being able to kind of zoom out and observe our own thinking, being able to zoom out and look at our living rooms and see what things we have stored in our boxes allows for us to unpack our boxes. In other words, our boxes are not the same as our identities, right? Such that, you know, there's lots of conversations about anti-racism, and anti-racism is an ongoing practice, right? That we don't have to own racism. We can actually be doing the work of anti-racism, right? So it's, again, it's not a character trait. The ability to disconnect those actions and beliefs from identity allows for us to grow. And it also allows for our practices to grow, right? Then we can create spaces of belonging for the people that we serve, not just the children that we serve, but also, really importantly, their families as well, the communities as well. Any thoughts on that? Put it in the chat or out loud.
No comments in the chat just yet.
that also is related to this idea of niceness and kindness. So again, the opposite of the isms isn't nice, right? However, there's an emphasis on nice. I was having this conversation with someone recently and they were like, "Are you telling us to not be nice?" And I was like, yeah, in a word, yes. I'm actually saying be kind, right? Because niceness, here's the difference between niceness and kindness. Niceness avoids or is fearful of difficult conversations. Niceness sees vulnerability as uncomfortable. Niceness hides true feelings to be socially acceptable and politically correct. Niceness shuns courage in favor of comfort. Niceness is passive. Niceness is very polite on the surface, but hides true feelings. Niceness assumes to know and is often based on stereotypes and preconceived notions. Niceness is not internally reflective. On the other hand, kindness, which is what this work requires, kindness is honest. Kindness is vulnerable. Kindness leads into discomfort. It challenges the status quo, even if the challenge isn't socially accepted. In other words, what this means is that doing the work of diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, or rather doing the work of inclusion and belonging, does not always feel nice, right? But it's always kind, right? Kindness takes a stand for justice, even when it isn't popular. It requires courage and bravery. It is active. It avoids making assumptions in favor of curiosity. It builds trust. It lessens anxiety. And kindness is the basis of belonging. It is necessary to create belonging for the people that we serve and also for their families.
I'm going to share a comment from the chat. Jay Hinkler had shared that your analogy is beautifully put. It's something that's especially poignant for us up north, where niceness has also become a character quality that white folks are incredibly attached to.
Yeah. I was reading, I'll have to find this article and share that niceness, niceness is part of whiteness, right? That white people globally are socialized to be nice, right? Which I think is really interesting, because as I interact with my own family members from the South or my own family members from West Africa, sometimes it might feel a bit harsh because there's honesty, and that honesty doesn't always feel nice, right? And you think about the way that socialization occurs and what sorts of conversations are happening at dinner tables or at holidays, right? Is it rooted in niceness or is it rooted in kindness? Now, I am not at all suggesting that we should all be blunt to the point of creating discomfort for people. However, I am suggesting that when we are engaging with people, that we are honest, that we are vulnerable, that we do take a look inside and think about, what boxes do I have stored? What things do I have stored inside of my boxes that presents as a barrier to inclusiveness? So then belonging, and I like to define belonging. Belonging is really the basis of, I think, it is the basis of inclusion, right? In order to fully be included, we have to have a sense of belonging. And belonging goes beyond good feelings. Belonging refers to the human emotional need to affiliate and be accepted by members of a group. Belonging is what allows members of a community to feel as though they can be their authentic selves in kindness without fear of different treatments or punishment. It has a major impact on performance and retention for employees, and also, honestly, for students and families as well, right? And so people will perform beyond what we expect if they feel as though they belong. Belonging also, I like to also talk about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which is really one of the most well-known ideas in the field of psychology, right? So Maslow's hierarchy of needs begins with the physiological needs into safety needs. Just above the safety needs, belongingness and love, right? So for this model, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, even before we can reach positive self-esteem, even before we can reach self-actualization and our full potential and creativity and all of those things, even before we can reach that, there is a need to belong. In other words, belonging is not just something that we, that's nice to have. Belonging is an actual need. Now, I should also say, and I will also say, that this model, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, has been critiqued for a number of reasons. One of the reasons that it's been critiqued, and it's a really significant reason, is that Maslow stole this idea from an indigenous group in North America and made it very individually centered. And so there's that critique. Another critique is that it assumes that identities happen in a very kind of linear fashion. And that's also a very valid critique, because it isn't that we reach our esteem needs, we have positive self-esteem, then we reach self-actualization and there's nowhere else to go, right? Much of this is extremely cyclical. So if I move to a different space, even if I have reached self-actualization, which some folks say we don't ever reach self-actualization, but that's a whole nother critique, right? So anyway, this model has experienced some critique, so much so that there's actually been a shift in the way that we think about belongingness, right? And the way that we think about what does it mean and what are our needs. And so what it really looks like is connection is at the center. So in this model, it's again, kind of linear, sort of. In this model, connection is at the center. And how do we have connection? In order to have connection, there is safety, order, and certainty, community, belonging, and love, food, shelter, and sex or intimacy. And sex and intimacy are different. Esteem, reputation, and competence, and all of those things center around connection. How do we build community? We build community through these elements. One of the most powerful statements I've heard as we begin to think about creating spaces of belonging by John A. Powell, who he works with the Othering and Belonging Institute, coined many of these terms, really influential in the field. He says, when people are situated the same, we treat them with sameness. When people are situated differently, we treat them differently. So recognizing difference as well is important in belonging. The opposite of belonging, right? So on the other end of the spectrum is othering. And othering is a set of dynamics, processes, structures that engender marginality and persistence, inequality across any of the full range of human differences based on group identities. And really, when I say the full range of human differences, I mean the full range of human differences, and much of it is extremely arbitrary, right? And honestly, things like race is socially constructed, and therefore it is rather arbitrary, although it has really significant social meanings, but it has social meanings based on the meanings that we give to it, right? So another example of this, I'm a vegan. And because I'm a vegan, people on the social medias, they added me to these like vegan groups on the social medias, on Facebook. And in this vegan group, a couple of months ago, there was a young lady who posted in the group. She said, you know, I'm not quite a vegan yet, but I need to move to a plant-based lifestyle because I have health issues. My doctor suggested that I begin to eat a plant-based diet. And she said, so the question that I have is such a fabulous question. The question that I have is, has anyone found anything, any meat substitutes that taste like bacon? And I was like, it's a great question, right? Like I can give you some meat substitutes that taste like bacon, only because at this point in my journey, I have no idea what bacon tastes like, right? So she was like, you know, I don't want to give up bacon. Bacon is delicious. So I need a substitute for bacon before I go complete plant-based. And people began to say things to her on this post. You're not a real vegan. You don't want to be a vegan. Why? Who let you into this group? Who let her into this group? Somebody let a non-vegan. Oh my God, I can't believe. And I thought in that moment, what a great example of othering, because it's something that happens with something so arbitrary like bacon, right? But the same thing, a similar thing happens when it comes to linguistic differences, right? Oh my God, when are you going to begin to speak? Oh my God, you don't know how to, you don't speak standard English. Oh my God, these people, they just speak Ebonics. They, you know, they don't really speak, right? So arbitrary, and yet we other based on that. But as we are helpers, as we are working with people, and truly, I honestly believe not only in our professions, but also this carries over as we are in Target, right? How are we engaging with people such that we are creating spaces of belonging and being inclusive instead of othering, right? And so thinking about it in that way, any difference, the full range of human differences, every single one of them are rather arbitrary, because at our core, we all have the same basic needs. And of those same basic needs, belonging is crucial. Community is crucial. And so, related to that, what we know, or what we think we know, and how we communicate what we know is never objective or without bias. We filter everything that we know through a lens of experience and memories and culture and history and feelings and mood and hunger and what my mama said and what my religion says and all of that, right? So we filter everything that we know through all of these lenses. The challenge is to always analyze our knowing to determine how it impacts our communication and behavior. One of those things that impacts our knowing is culture, right? Culture impacts and oftentimes dictates what we know. Culture also dictates how we create boxes, right? What we see, what we perceive is dictated by culture. So culture is the customs, arts, social institutions, achievements of particular nation, people, or other social group. Oftentimes we think of culture only in terms of ethnicity, but culture is rather expansive, right? So we can think about the culture of a region. What is the culture of Northern Illinois, right? It's a particular culture that exists. Not only are there the things that exist within culture, but culture also includes the social behaviors and norms, as well as the knowledge, the beliefs, the customs, the capabilities, and the habits of individuals within these groups. In order to create spaces of belonging, one, we have to recognize that our culture impacts what we know. There are some people who recognize that, and they believe that what we have to do then is we should be culturally competent. And I must tell you my bias. I am not a fan of the idea of cultural competence. Here's the definition of cultural competence. Cultural competence is the ability to interact effectively with people of various cultures, various cultural, racial, ethnic, socioeconomic, religious, and social group. Cultural competence is often tackled by learning the patterns of behaviors, beliefs, the languages, values, and customs of various groups. On the other hand, we have cultural humility, and cultural humility involves the ongoing process of self-exploration, self-critique, combined with a willingness to learn from others. It means entering into a relationship with another person with the intention of honoring their beliefs, their customs, and their values, and acknowledging differences and accepting that person for who they are. In other words, here's the difference. Cultural competence is I know, while cultural humility is I'm curious about. Cultural competence involves othering, while cultural humility is the ongoing process of self-exploration and critique. So it's really internally reflective. Cultural competence is the perception of self-knowledge, while cultural humility is the willingness to learn from others. Cultural competence is rooted in, unfortunately, ethnocentric ideology, or I know, while cultural humility is the intention of honoring the beliefs, the customs, the values, or it is cultural relativism. Cultural competence is sympathy and saviorism, while cultural humility is empathy and compassion. Cultural competence is I'm the expert, while cultural humility is you are the experts of your world. Cultural competence is the perception of an end goal, for example, quotas, right? We have cultural competence, therefore we have a quota of people who we will hire, of the clientele that we will serve, the number of people who will live in our neighborhoods. While cultural humility is the consistent learning and unlearning, and the unlearning, because of the way that culture operates, it's really important. Cultural competence is the frequent fundamental attribution error, and cultural humility is acknowledging power imbalances and balancing those. And I will talk about what this is in a second. So the fundamental attribution error. But the three facets of cultural humility is the lifelong self-critique, right? It is consistently opening those boxes and looking to see what we have stored. It is consistently engaging in maintenance work. It is consistently challenging power imbalances. It is an affiliation with advocacy group. And so for the helpers, what does this look like? This looks like having knowledge about cultures and cultural perspectives without ranking them, right? Practitioners also have the skills or use the skills to utilize culturally appropriate approaches, whether that means, I honestly think that this means like deferring, right? So I cannot presume to know. And then also there is awareness of cultural heritage and the influence of culture on attitudes, beliefs, and experiences, again, without believing that my way, my cultural beliefs, the things that I know are better, because again, it's important to recognize that what I know is influenced by my own culture. Any thoughts on this difference, the difference between cultural competence and cultural humility?
So I was thinking about the lifelong self-critique and going back to the why is this conversation difficult? And basically engaging in a lifelong self-critique sounds difficult. And it's wonderful to do. And when you can get there and have honest conversations internally, it feels freeing, right? But you also have to see things that you want to be different about yourself, right? And know and understand what needs to change or how things should have been different in the past. And that's hard. That's hard work.
Absolutely. I agree, Ellen. As you were talking too, I also think that it is incredibly challenging. And one of the most important things to have as we are doing this work, and for myself as well, being able to have supports, right? So being able to think about, well, what does self-care look like? Because this work is hard. And so I personally, I'm really fortunate. I have two sisters, and one of my sisters is a dean of students at a high school. Another of my sisters is she's a coach in equity, really focusing on ability. And so the three of us, we really provide support for each other. And so being able to find communities of people, being able to connect with people as we do this work, because that constant self-critique, that constant, it's so much easier to be like, okay, well, today I'm taking a break from it. I'm just gonna, right? That's the easy thing to do, but actually it's not easy. I'm saying that it's not that easy. It's almost like pick your hard, right? Because creating spaces of belonging in the long run, engaging in cultural humility in the long run, ensuring that our practices are beneficial to the people that we serve in the long run is so much easier than trying to maintain homeostasis. I think that's completely my bias. Like I guess what I'm saying is, yes, it's hard, but you gotta do it.
We had a question from someone in the chat, if I could share.
Yeah.
Someone had asked, I think to get to the root of the question, they were asking if cultural competency and cultural humility are on a spectrum, or are they distinctly different? Can you work through cultural competence to get to cultural humility, or do they have to stay separate?
I think, I believe, this is again my bias, that they are on a spectrum. I think we started cultural. It's almost like what I was saying earlier, when we began to have these conversations in the 1980s, right? We had to start there. The only way that we can be having this conversation is to have had those conversations and learned some lessons. And so there is a spectrum. Another example of this, there's a one particular school that I work with, and I've been working with them. This is going into our third academic year. And when we first began to have conversations, we started with like, what is implicit bias, right? At the end of last school year, last month, we were having conversations about vulnerability, creating anti-racist education, and being transformative in our educational practices. There was no way for us to have conversations about being transformative in our educational practices back in 2019 when we first began the work. And so we created this map showing all the conversations that we had and how far we've come along that continuum, such that we can really appreciate the journey, right? So again, going back to the happiest place on earth, we thought that where we would end up would be, all right, let's pull apart and let's look at language. And now instead of doing that, we're having conversations about what does transformation look like in education? And so there's the continuum, there's kind of the arc of where we start and where we hope to go. And honestly, even as we begin to have conversations about, even as we have conversations about cultural humility, a year from now, we might look and say, this isn't far enough, right? What's the next step? At least that's the hope. So I mentioned attribution theory. So cultural competence often leads to, or often has embedded within it, some fundamental attribution errors. And attribution theory, another of the kind of more well-known theories in psychology, is that we attempt to understand the behaviors of others by attributing feelings, beliefs, and intentions onto them. And there are two ways of explaining behaviors. The first way is called the dispositional attribution, or behavior is related to character. The second is the situational attribution. Behavior is related to a specific situation. So the dispositional attribution means that if I perceive someone to be, frequently, if I perceive someone to be different than me, then I explain their behaviors as related to something that is related to that difference, right? So the reason why they engaged in that behavior is because of whatever thing that we don't have in common. The situational attribution, though, frequently it is used when I see commonality or kinship or likeness. So behavior is related to the specific situation. So if someone engages in a behavior that I disagree with, well, I know that I wouldn't normally do that. They are similar to me. Because they are similar to me, then I can assume that they also would not normally do that. The situation called for it. They engaged in that behavior simply because something that is situational, something that is external to them, their hand was forced, right? Often, sometimes I see this in education where people will say things like, well, you know, those kind of parents, the parents on this side of town, they don't come to parent-teacher conferences. It's just because they don't care. Or actually, I had a conversation with someone last week, and the teacher said, well, you know, the student, they didn't do their work. You know why they didn't do their work? Because they didn't care. And I was like, no, there's probably some other possibilities there. Kids care about their work. They absolutely care about their work, right? But if we assume there's something that is different between them and myself, the reason why they did not do their work was because they just didn't care. When I was a social worker, I had other colleagues. I had a parent who their partner was an undocumented immigrant. This mother had 11 children and was expecting a 12th child. And she was oftentimes concerned that if she came for a visit at the agency, that people would begin to ask her about her partner. And so she wouldn't come to family visits because fear, right? Like, my partner is going to be found out. I don't work. I have 11 kids. 10 of them are in care. 1 is with me, and I'm expecting another baby. If I come, my baby might be taken from me, and also my partner might be found out, and then I lose a place to live. I was having a conversation with a colleague one time, and she's like, I don't know why she just keeps having babies. She stopped having babies. She just doesn't care about anything. She didn't come to visit. She don't care about these kids. And I was like, there's so many, it's such a nuanced conversation, right? And so what my colleague was doing was engaging in a dispositional attribution, right? These sorts of moms, they just don't care. I'm not like that, so, right? And so that's really what the fundamental attribution error is: ignoring the difference or ignoring the influence of the situation on behavior and emphasizing perceived personal deficiencies. The reason why that person does this thing is related to the thing that we have different, but also it's a personal deficiency. It's related to their character. Or it looks like this: when it is something that within a person we observe, we make an internal attribution or a dispositional attribution. If it is caused by something that is external, we make an external attribution or a situational attribution. One of my favorite examples as well is, I like to call it the Les Mis example. The Les Mis example goes like this: if someone steals a loaf of bread, if I perceive them to be different than me, then I will say the reason why they stole the loaf of bread is because, you know, everyone in that neighborhood, everyone like them, everyone that is somehow different than me steals. If I perceive them to be like me, well, the reason why they stole the loaf of bread is because their child was hungry. That's something that is external, right? That's something that is situational. And so far too often when we are using, unfortunately, when we're simply using cultural competence, which I don't want it to sound like that's not a important step. However, if we remain there, we are far more likely to fall victim to the fundamental attribution error, which does not create spaces of belonging and inclusion. Any thoughts on that piece? Or questions?
No chat comments yet.
Okay. All right.
Could I ask a question?
Yes, please.
So when you're talking about attribution, I just needed to understand a little bit more, because what is the mindset or the approach that you take if you're not doing the external attribution piece? In other words, in terms, I'm a social worker, so I am thinking in terms of working with the different populations. So outside of saying something like the attribution piece, which I think I would normally do, to say, you know, they're hungry, you know, it's because they're hungry, you know, they don't have enough to eat. What's the alternative to that?
Oh, okay. So the majority of our behaviors, I'm sorry, I didn't explain that all the way. The majority of our behaviors are related to situations, right? For everyone. The reason why we behave oftentimes in the way that we behave is related to an external stimuli. So for people who have children in care, the choices that people have made that have led to their children being in care is often not something that is an internal thing. It's often related to, on a macro level, the structures of society that create inequities related to race, gender, class, right? So people make choices related to kind of those constraints. And so these two things are really opposite of each other. When we are working with clients, when we're working with families, we should consider always this: what possibilities are there? What situations may have led them to engage in those behaviors? Does that make sense?
Yes, and I feel better now, because I thought, I was like, oh my gosh, I've been doing social work all wrong my whole life.
No. So the fundamental attribution error suggests that we tend to do this.
Okay,
right?
okay.
We say that it is something wrong with them.
Okay.
Rather than paying attention to the situation. We should be paying attention to the situation. I'm so sorry. Thank you for asking that question.
That's okay. It was me, and I apologize. But I do thank you, because I do feel not, and I was okay with feeling uncomfortable, but I just felt like that was a paradigm shift for me for a little bit. But I thank you for clarifying.
We should absolutely be paying attention to the situation.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for that question, because I do not want anyone to leave thinking, oh man. So thank you. So what challenges exist to belonging, inclusion, and cultural humility? Really quickly, one of the major challenges, and we'll talk more about this next week as well, but one of the major challenges that exist to cultural humility and belonging and creating spaces of inclusion is bias, the biases that we hold. And I said this already, but humans, every single one of us have biases. Like, it's just a part of who and what we are, right? And so oftentimes people collapse prejudice and bias. Although prejudice and bias are related, they are different things. Prejudice is a prejudgment. It is an attitude toward or about a person based on their group membership, while a bias is an inclination for or against a person, group, or a concept. A bias, particularly an unconscious or implicit bias, is instinctively categorizing people and things without fully being aware of it. It is a flaw in thinking that is guided by past experiences and mental preconditioning. It is seeing an animal with 4 legs and hair all over their body and tossing them into the box that's labeled dog. And it happens without us even thinking about it. It's also important to recognize that many of the biases that we have, we are not consciously aware of them. In other words, if we go back to the example of the moving day, sometimes as we have unpacked all the stuff that we have moved into the house, we don't realize that there are still some boxes over in the corner until we trip over it, right? And so we are not always consciously aware of our biases. There is no harm in recognizing and acknowledging that we have biases. In fact, it is beneficial for us to recognize and acknowledge that we have biases. It is, however, what we do with our biases that matter. So how do we deal with our biases? The first thing that we should do is know them, right? So making the invisible visible, opening those boxes, looking to see what we have inside, recognizing that they exist, being mindful of our words and actions. The second thing that we should do is think critically, looking at people, interactions, problems as multifaceted and not as a coin with 2 sides. This graphic uses the example of the diamond. I didn't create this graphic, although I think it's a fabulous graphic. It's created by, it's published by QA Aspire. My favorite example is the Rubik's Cube, and I'll talk about that in a second. But looking at things, people, interactions as a Rubik's Cube with multiple facets and not as a coin with 2 sides. And finally, number 3, challenging assumptions and traditions, asking why and why not often, always remaining in the state of curiosity. So, not all prejudice and bias is intentional. In fact, the majority of prejudice and bias is unintentional. It's not even recognized. It may be influenced by experience, by socialization, but based on learned associations between various categories and qualities, including attractiveness, race, gender, social class, language, right? Implicit bias, implicit stereotypes and attributions, while not always at the conscious level, do have real consequences. And because we are not always consciously aware of the biases, those consequences can be rather devastating, especially if we are not thinking about our biases as we engage in the helping professions. So how do we understand the complexity of people? Again, the Rubik's Cube example. I see people as a Rubik's Cube personally. And when I say that, I mean, our intersecting identities all fall somewhere on this Rubik's Cube. So this might be my gender, this might be my sex, this might be my socioeconomic status, this might be my race, this might be my occupation, this might be my motherhood, this might be my immigration status. And so all of my intersecting identities and my statuses, who I am in relation to other people, fall somewhere on this Rubik's Cube. The beauty of this is that, again, all of us are Rubik's Cubes with intersecting identities. And my intersecting identities are truly intersectional, right? Such that if the red is my gender and the green is my race, one cannot presume to know anything about my gender without also paying attention to my race, right? within our classrooms, as we work with youth in care, as we work with families, right? If we can see this in ourselves, then we can begin to understand that for other people. The other piece about this too is that when I show up to the world, not only am I showing up like this and like this and like this, I am really showing up like that, right? So I'm showing up just like this. When we rely on implicit bias to understand people, implicit bias turns multidimensional people who are multifaceted into one-dimensional ideas. This is, again, really important as we think about the folks that we serve, right? If we consider race and gender and class and geographic location and immigration status and linguistic ability and single motherhood or single fatherhood and prior experiences, prior lived experiences and family structures. And if we consider all of that, then we can understand how and why people are showing up in the world in the way in which they are showing up. If we don't consider that, then we are asking that people show up like this. And sometimes the reason why, so going to the earlier conversation about the young man being so upset while in the store, it is likely that there's an expectation in many facets of his life that he shows up like this. And imagine how constraining that is, which then leads to faster frustration, right? And it's a more nuanced conversation, because then we have to have conversations about microaggressions and privilege and, right, and experiences of racism that impact the way that we interact with others and health disparities and all of those things. But really it boils down to implicit bias turns multidimensional people into one-dimensional ideas, which leads to a great deal of constraints, which then leads to frustration, right? And so again, recognizing that we are all Rubik's Cubes, and sometimes my Rubik's Cube looks like this. And I have to do this quickly and turn it back quickly, because I don't really know how to do a Rubik's Cube. But sometimes my Rubik's Cube looks like this, and it's all mixed up, right? And none of us are one-dimensional ideas. And sorry, I'm going to turn this right back, or else I'll have to have my daughter fix it for me later. All right, did it. So, yay. Any questions, any thoughts on the Rubik's Cube example?
I found it very interesting. Sorry, I didn't want to cut anybody else. I just want to say that it's actually really, really interesting. And what you have said is actually very true. Like the way we want to present ourselves is basically like the way the group, what's it called? The rubric? What you were presenting, sorry.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. And sometimes I also add that, you know, for some of our clients or our students or our family members, showing up to an office setting, they know if I show up whole, I might experience some stigma, or I might have some people looking at me weird, or I might have some folks not appreciating my wholeness. And so rather than show up whole, we begin to take stickers off, right? Like take stickers off and leave them. But what that means is that we're showing up not whole. And again, going back to the hierarchy of needs and also that connection piece, right? If I'm not able to be whole, how well am I able to make connections? if I am not able to be whole, how well am I able to reach self-actualization? If I show up not whole, how well am I able to accomplish the things that there is an expectation of me to accomplish, right? And so it is our job to encourage folks that we work with to show up whole. And if those things, if there are some areas where there can be growth, being able to assist the folks that we serve in growing, right? Being able to assist the folks that we serve in connecting them to resources. If I'm not able to provide you with that service, then I can connect you to some resource such that you can continue to show up whole. Any other thoughts on this example? In face-to-face sessions, I give everyone a Rubik's Cube, and we sit and we write on the Rubik's Cube kind of our identities or the ones that we most connect to, and think about what that means as we are navigating the world. So we're not face-to-face, and I can't send you Rubik's Cubes over the airwaves, but it is a really interesting example, a really interesting activity to engage in, just using a Rubik's Cube, kind of putting on there like, you know, who am I as I show up in the world? And how does that impact the way I'm able to navigate the world, the way that I perceive the world, and also the way that people perceive me? That also, again, gives us some insight into how other folks are navigating the world as well.
Lots of great feedback about your Rubik's Cube example. It's really relatable and easy to understand. Kathy Webb had shared that she sees that kind of one-dimensional view with her students, or when they experience trauma the day before, and teachers just ask where their homework is. They don't consider their full life existence.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And then Yothi had shared that essentially we're allowing our others' implicit biases to restructure our image to attempt to fit the picture that we imagine other people want to see when we don't show up as our full authentic self.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. I had a client. She worked in corporate America, and we talked one day about having a conversation about bringing our whole selves to work. And she said that sometimes she arrives at work 20 minutes early just to sit outside and to like take off the stuff that isn't valued in the space. And then she goes into the workspace, not whole, right? But the time that she has used to like take off stuff, and then the time that she uses after work to recover is also part of her workday, right? To me, when I had this conversation with her, I'm like, that seemed like that's the hardest part of the workday. And I don't know, because not being whole in the workplace is also hard, but right. So thinking about it in that way, I believe helps us to have more understanding more understanding of ourselves, but also more understanding for the people that we serve and the people that we work with. So what tools can we use? The first tool is to be curious, right? So again, related to cultural humility, being able to be curious. And I tell folks that curiosity is about 90% internally reflective and only about 10% external. Oftentimes, I think my bias is we do curiosity wrong, right? We do curiosity frequently externally. Tell me about you. Tell me about what you experienced. Tell me about. But if we do it externally always, then we are not spending the time thinking about the biases that we might have that might even color the questions that we ask, right? So if we aren't spending the time thinking about our own biases, going through the process of unpacking our own boxes and engaging in the maintenance work, then unfortunately, sometimes the questions that we ask might be a bit off-putting, might have some underlying implicit biases, or unfortunately, might present as a microaggression. And so it's so important for us to be curious. And as we are curious, thinking about, as we interact with people, what ideas might I have about this individual person? How is that impacted by my own intersections of reality? How is that impacted by the things that I may have learned through socialization? How am I presenting to them in a way that is creating inclusion and belonging, right? So the first strategy is to be curious and being internally curious. The second strategy is to be comfortable with being uncomfortable. And we've talked about this kind of at length today. But what we know is that comfort does not allow for growth. So growth lies just outside of the comfort zone. My son is a newborn, but he was born almost 8 years ago. So he'll be 8 next month, last week. He was born last week, but it was 8 years ago. You get it. Which, anyway. So at the beginning of last school year, this year he's going into 3rd grade. So at the beginning of his 1st grade year, he was a little guy. He was kind of short and he's really slim. And he was wearing a size 5 in pants at the start of last school year. About a week into the school year, because I bought him his size 5s in like August. September comes, he starts to go to school. A week into the school year, he's getting out of the car and I see his ankles. What? Does he have, what pants? What happened here? And I realized he'd had a little bit growth spurt. A couple weeks, so I bought him some size 6 pants. A couple weeks later, he was lying in bed, and for a week, every night he was saying, "Mom, my legs hurt. My bones hurt inside of my body. Mom, my legs, Mom." And I would give him a little bit of Tylenol. And a couple weeks later, he was getting out of the car and I looked and I was like, I see this kid's ankles. Are these the size 5 that he has on? Why didn't he just put on the size 6? And then I looked and he was wearing the size 6 and what he really needed was a size 8. So we went from a size 5 to a size 8 in like 2 months. And what I also realized was that all of those nights that he was lying in bed saying, "Mom, my legs hurt. My bones hurt inside of my body." What I realized was that he was having a second growth spurt. He was literally growing. He was literally being stretched. And what I think happens when we begin to think about people as Rubik's Cubes, and when we begin to think about ourselves as Rubik's Cubes, and when we begin to challenge our own biases, and when we begin to think about the difference between niceness and kindness and being honest and vulnerable rather than not rocking the boat, when we begin to do that, we are literally being stretched such that we are saying, "Oh, this self-reflection, it hurts." But as we do that, the area that was once growth now becomes the area that is comfortable. And the area that was once overwhelmed now becomes the new opportunity for growth, right? So then we can expand our reach. We can continue to grow and grow and grow. And I guarantee you that in our practice, whether we are working in education or whether we are working in social services, as we engage with people in general, whether we're working and talking to people, buying stuff in Target or the grocery store, right? Our ability to connect with people will continue to grow and grow and grow and expand. I honestly believe and hope that when people interact with me, no matter where I am, and this is just my bias, no matter where I am or what hat I am wearing, as soon as I wake up in the morning and before I go to bed at night, I hope that people, when they interact with me, they think, I belong here, right? Whatever space I'm in, I hope that people think I belong here. And that can only happen if I am continuing to be internally reflective, internally curious, and being willing to be uncomfortable, consistently uncomfortable. Another example of this, when I first began teaching in Northern Illinois, I taught a race and ethnicity class. This race and ethnicity class, my first semester, coming from Chicago, moving to Northern Illinois, which has an interesting relationship with race. That first semester, I was like, I don't want to do this here anymore. This is too uncomfortable, right? Folks, they stare, and not just stare, there's glaring. So I'm making them uncomfortable, and that's uncomfortable for me. I don't want to do it. And I spoke with the chair of my department, and the chair of my department said, oh no, you're gonna keep doing this until you get uncomfortable or until you get comfortable with being uncomfortable, right? And 12 years later, every semester, I have taught at least one race and ethnicity class, and it is still uncomfortable. And that discomfort also still includes constant self-reflection and self-evaluation. So that's the second strategy. The third strategy is making sure that we're engaging in self-care. So I kind of alluded to this earlier. This is challenging work, right? Constant self-reflection, constant thinking about, how am I engaging with people? How are folks feeling as though they belong in my space? Am I engaging in the work of social services and education? Am I engaging in that work in a way that is inclusive? That is challenging work. And so the third strategy is to make sure that we are taking care of ourselves as we do this work. So self-management is taking the responsibility of my own behavior and my own well-being. Self-care is the practice of taking an active role in protecting my own well-being and happiness, in particular during periods of stress. And so sometimes that might mean, you know what, this is challenging work. The work of education and the work of social services by itself is challenging, but then the additional layer of inclusion and belonging is also challenging work. So ensuring that we have supports near to help us as we are having moments of crisis. And crisis is also just part of the human condition, right? So this is the third strategy, self-management and self-care, heavy on the self-care. And we can think about, what does self-care look like, right? It might look like moments of, I need to read, or I need to just disconnect. I need to get off of social media. I need to, right? So again, self-care and self-management. I'd love to end with these two questions. So how does this conversation, the takeaway, how does this conversation most relate to your work? And what tools can you take away that will impact your work? So how does it relate to your work? And what tools can you take away that will impact your work going forward? And so I'd love for us to sit with those questions for just a moment. But also, what do we do as we continue to engage in this work? Number one, we acknowledge that we all prejudge and have biases. Number two, being aware of our biases, so intentionally making the invisible visible for ourselves. Number three, check and question our biases constantly, so engaging in curiosity, self-reflection and curiosity. Number four, be vulnerable and give grace. So be vulnerable and giving grace to ourselves and others. Again, recognizing that we all prejudge, we all have biases, and we are able to give grace to ourselves, even if we make an unintentional faux pas, right? Avoid being paralyzed by shame and guilt. Oops, I see a typo. Avoid being paralyzed by shame and guilt. Recognizing that shame and guilt exist as we engage in conversations, and even as we move along into conversations about privilege and microaggressions and what does it look like to be anti-racist, right? Recognizing that shame, blame, and guilt are boxes that sit over in the corner. Recognize them, acknowledge them, and being determined not to be paralyzed by them. Acknowledge that we never fully arrive, being open to always learning and to sometimes getting it wrong. And then finally, recognizing that our biases do not make us bad people, they make us human. It is the awareness, or it is what we do rather with that awareness that truly matters. So if we can take just 1 minute to think about these two questions, how does this conversation most relate to your work? And then finally, what tools can you take away that will impact your work? And I'm gonna turn it back over to Billy or Pam.
Great, thanks so much, Jessica. This was a fantastic session this morning, and we've had a lot of comments in the chat about how valuable they found your presentation to be. If anybody has any last comments or questions, feel free to unmute or drop them in the chat. I'll give you just a second to do that. And if we don't see anything, I'll just continue. So again, thank you, Jessica, and thank you everyone for joining us this morning. Know that we will meet again next week at the same time. I will send you a link to the recording with a reminder the day before. I'll also send you a copy of today's recorded presentation, the slides for this morning, and then the workbook, which you've already received, but I'll make sure you get that also. Next week, when we meet, we're going to share information about how to engage in the work on building a culture of belonging in the Rockford region. And we did also share information on how to engage in the youth mental health system of care planning process. If you have questions on that or you missed anything in the chat, please feel free to reply to my reminder emails or to shoot me a message, and I'm happy to reach out and get you that information. Thank you so much, everybody.
Sorry.
I just have a quick question. How do we sign up for next week's training?
Great question. You're already signed up if you're here today, so I will send that reminder, and it's going to be the exact same link. So save that information. What was the second question we had?
Sorry. So yeah, you said about a workbook. You said I didn't got any workbook or anything. Yeah, I'm just saying, like, I don't know, like, I wasn't aware that you guys were sending that, or yeah, sorry.
That's fine. Just drop your email in the chat. I'll make sure that it's in the list. If you got the link from me for this morning, it's attached to that email, and you'll get it again when I send out the reminder.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
No need to apologize. I'm sure other people have the same question.
Thanks.
All right, great. Thanks so much, everybody. Have a great rest of your morning.
Thanks, Jessica. Thank you all. See you next week.